Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 115, Mrs. Mort. Just a warning, there is information in this episode that may be distressing to some. In December 1920 in Sydney, Claude John Tozer, an unmarried doctor, was having an affair with a 32-year-old married woman, Mrs. Dorothy Mort, who was his patient. Dorothy murdered Claude. Dorothy was married to Harold Sutcliffe Mort, a member of the wealthy T.S. Mort family of industrialists, pastoralists and churchmen. More on Harold's family is in bonus episodes 20 and 21. They had 2 children, Virginia 8 and Morris 6, at the time of the murder. Dorothy Mort was described as an aspiring motion picture star who lay in a dangerous condition with a self-inflicted wound to her chest and having taken laudanum after she murdered Claude. As an outpouring of grief over Dr. Tozer gripped Sydney in the days over Christmas 1920 and into the new year, the press initially described Dorothy as beautiful, respected and admired. However, detectives arriving at her house soon discovered a cache of explosive letters written by Mrs. Mort. Mrs. Mort had told a friend before the shooting that she was pregnant to Dr. Tozer and that she was going to marry his brother — he didn't have a brother — and travel overseas. Her husband, Mr. H.S. Mort, was an engineer, a church warden and an avid stamp collector, and he said his wife was very hysterical. He said that she spoke of death frequently, had dreams about her children being burnt, and other nightmares of an unbalanced mind. Asked what the background to this was, Mr. Mort revealed that he feared his wife had a hereditary insanity, and that every December, on the anniversary of her father's death, she became affected. More on Dorothy's family is covered in bonus episode 19. A gunsmith told the court that Dorothy Mort had brought a Colt revolver from him 5 days before the tragedy, saying she wanted it as a present for her husband in India. He instructed her on how to use it. She was charged with murder and taken off to the Long Bay Penitentiary, where she lived like a grand dame. She remained there for 9 years as various supporters, including her husband, tried to secure her release. One female parolee told a newspaper that Mort held herself very aloof from the others. She was spoken of by the others as a very educated person. I heard that she is very delicate. In 1926, a report headlined "Belle of the Jail," calling Mort a star boarder of Long Bay. It is said that she spent her time in genteel seclusion, sewing, reading romantic novels. She did not live in a cell, but in a screened-off corner of Long Bay Prison Hospital with carpet and the general demeanour of a small bedroom. Apparently, she was close friends in jail with Eugenie Fellini from episode 107. Her husband paid for fresh flowers and fashionable clothes that she was allowed to wear instead of the prison uniform. The report said the ordinary prisoners, who have killed nobody, she shuns with aversion, even refusing to sit near them when she enters the hall dressed up for jail concerts. She prefers the association of the inebriates, who are not classed as prisoners. Mort wore diamond jewellery. She had a baker and butcher on call paid by her husband and was allowed to leave prison on occasion. In addition, she had a woman named Bella Carr as her servant. On the 16th of October 1929, Dorothy Mort was released. Dressed in a gingham dress with lace collar, pearls, stockings, high-heel shoes with ankle ribbons, she removed her hat for a mugshot, her eyes obscured by her hair. On the outside, Mort returned to her family, her daughter now 17 and her son 14. Her husband died in 1950 and Dorothy went on to live until 1966, dying at the age of 81. Dr. Claude John Tozer was born on the 27th of September 1890. He was the son of a Bank of New South Wales official, Jonathan Tozer, and Beatrice Charlton. He was a medical doctor and he was also a first-class cricketer who played for New South Wales. He was the nephew of the Australian Test cricketer Percy Charlton, who played in 2 tests for Australia and England in 1890 and 40 first-class matches for New South Wales. He was also a cousin of the Australian Olympic swimmer Andrew Boy Charlton, and more on Claude's family will be covered in bonus episode number 23. Claude was educated at the Sydney Church of England Grammar School and was a celebrated schoolboy cricketer in Sydney and a star student at the prestigious Shaw School. He captained the Shaw First 11th for several years, and while at school he was a member of the Cadet Corps, within which he attained the rank of Cadet Under Officer. He graduated from the University of Sydney with a Bachelor of Medicine in 1914. While at the university, he played for the university's cricket club and was a member of their premiership winning team in 1913 and 1914. Tozer juggled his early cricket career with medical studies at the university and as a resident at the Royal Hospital for Women in Paddington. Before the war, Tozer played first 4-class matches for New South Wales as a middle-order batsman. In May 1915, Claude Tozer announced his engagement but put his wedding plans on hold as he enlisted in the Australian Army Medical Corps, where he was assigned to join the 1st Field Ambulance in Gallipoli with the rank of captain. After the evacuation, he was hospitalised in Egypt with paratyphoid in early 1916. Rumours hit Sydney that he'd been killed during the Battle of the Lone Pine, venturing too close to the opposition front line while treating a wounded colleague. Some Sydney newspapers reported that Tozer was dead, prompting the flags at Sydney University to be flown half-mast. Sydney grey cricketers one weekend in October 1915 wore mourning armlets in honour of one of their most prominent players. However, some weeks later, the Army reported back to the distressed Tozer family that their only son was in fact alive. The family's relief, though, was relatively brief, as Tozer, late in 1916, served on the Western Front and was wounded severely in the head and the right leg in July 1916 during the Battle of Pozieres. He was close to death after being bombarded by the German artillery. A shell had exploded near him, leading to widespread injuries, including a fragment that lodged in his leg. Far more serious was that his head had been cut open by shrapnel. A substantial piece had passed into the right temporal lobe of his brain, lodging under his skull. For more than 2 days, Tozer was unconscious, and the medical staff were uncertain how to treat him. The doctors opted against operating, believing that the shrapnel was so close to the brain that it was too dangerous a procedure. They were convinced that one mistake during the operation and he would die on the table. He eventually recovered and after another bout of trench fever returned to France in January 1917 and served in various capacities in hospitals and field units. He was promoted to the rank of Major in June 1917. In November 1917 he was mentioned in dispatches by the commander of the British forces, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, for distinguished and gallant service and devotion to duty in the field, and was awarded the Distinguished Service Honour for when at Hooge he ignored his own safety in favour of the welfare of other soldiers. In early 1919 he returned home. However, it involved sadness, as just a few weeks before he was to marry his devoted fiancée, who'd waited 4 years for his return from the front, she suddenly took ill and died of septic pneumonia. To overcome his grief, which also included the mourning for his father's death, who had died in Sydney during the war, he resumed his duties with the state cricket team, this time as an opening batsman. In 1919 and 1920, he played his 5th first-class match against Queensland at Brisbane. He also made his Sheffield Shield debut in that season at the SCG against South Australia. Tozer by now was working as a general practitioner in Sydney's North Shore. His prolific 1920-1921 season in grade cricket earned him a selection for the Australian 11 to play against the touring MCC. As a medic, Dr. Tozer had built up a large list of clients, many of whom preferring house calls. Dorothy Mort had been referred to Tozer by her husband, who for some time had been deeply worried about his wife's erratic and often hysterical behaviour. Dorothy constantly complained of nervous problems following the horrific suicide of her deranged father. On the morning of Tuesday, December the 21st, 1920, Harold Sutcliffe Mort telephoned Claude Tozer about his wife Dorothy, who'd been in bed for 4 days. Tozer agreed to visit her at the family home. She was immediately besotted with him. She was known to have said, "I loved him immediately. He was so handsome and big and splendid that I thought how wonderful a son would be of his." Tozer, for his part, was wary, and when he returned home from the first visit, he told his mother, "I don't know why God made these neurotic women." But after several more house visits, he became infatuated, writing a succession of love letters to Mort that showed theirs was far more than the customary doctor-patient relationship. In one letter, Tozer wrote, "You have stirred me to such an extent, little lady, that you are now sitting, metaphorically, on a sleeping volcano. I am pretty restrained, I know. I have tried to be for years. But for you, that restraint is very nearly gone. I can't explain why." The love affair continued for 6 months, until Tozer was told he would captain the New South Wales team to play Queensland at the SCG, starting on New Year's Day 1921. He had also been assured by the Australian selectors that he was in their sights. Concerned that Mrs. Mort was becoming over-possessive and irrational and worrying about the scandal if her husband and the Sydney press found out, Tozer decided it was time to end it. It would not help an Australian Test aspirant to be exposed in the tabloids as a cad. On the 15th of December 1920, he and his lover met. He told her that he had just become engaged to another woman. He tried to explain that it was not proper for a doctor to be unmarried and that he would be struck off if it was discovered what he had been up to with a patient. Mrs. Mort appeared relatively calm, so Tozer agreed to meet her again the following morning to say their final farewells. But that had to be delayed for several days due to his heavy workload, and there was also a test match to attend. On the first day's play in the Australia-England Sydney Test, Tozer was sighted sitting alongside Alan Kippax's father Percy near the sight screen at the northern end of the SCG. He told numerous friends at the cricket that day to keep a spot for him on the following day. After making a few observation calls, he said he would attend a cricket luncheon, watch the afternoon's play before going to the theatre that evening with a lady friend. The observation call included a visit to the Mort household. Tozer was completely unaware that his previous meeting had devastated Dorothy, prompting her to make a drastic trip to the city where she bought poison and a firearm. On Tuesday, the 21st of December 1920 at 11:30 a.m, Tozer parked his car in Tryon Road, Linfield, and walked to the house known as Inglebrae, the home of Harold and Dorothy Mort and their family. Harold was at work. Dorothy was at home with the maid and the 2 children. She was agitated, irrational and distracted. Mrs. Mort asked Tozer to wait in the drawing room. As he sat, Tozer failed to notice a Colt automatic pistol poking out from behind a flower vase on a ledge to his left. She entered the room, sat next to Tozer on the couch, passed him a photo of herself inscribed with, "From the woman you swore you loved," and fired a single bullet into his head. He'd been shot in the back of the head, in the temple and in the chest. A bullet would be found lodged in the roof of his nose. His head wounds were adjacent to the scars he bore from the Western Front in France. His vest had been rebuttoned over the chest wound and the Colt pistol was on his lap. On Wednesday the 22nd of December, the Australian team took the field at the SCG wearing black armbands. Tozer was due to play as New South Wales captain in the match against Queensland on the 1st of January 1921. And the subsequent articles relating to the event on the 29th of December 1920, the Linfield tragedy, Mrs. Mort charged with murder. There were developments today in regards to the sensational shooting case at Linfield. Mrs. H. Mort was this afternoon formally charged with having murdered Dr. Tozer. Mrs. Mort is now receiving treatment in the Royal North Shore Hospital. Her condition showed an improvement today. It says Mr. Adrian, the Chief Stipendiary Magistrate, accompanied by Mr. Freeman, a deposition clerk, and Inspector Leary, visited the Royal North Shore Hospital and saw Mrs. Mort, who's been treated for a bullet wound which extends from her chest to her back. It was the intention of officials prior to their attendance at the hospital to prefer a charge of murder should Mrs. Mort's bodily condition be considered such as to warrant that step. A charge of willful murder was formally made against Mrs. Mort, who made no reply, and she was remanded to the Central Police Court on the 6th of January. However, in the Grafton Daily Examiner on the 15th of January 1921, it says a further stage was reached today in the case of the Linfield tragedy. Mrs. Mort is still in hospital at the Reformatory for Women at Long Bay. It was there that Mr. E.A. Pryor, the Assistant Chamber Magistrate of the Central Police Court, established a temporary court. Mr. Pryor was accompanied by Mr. Hayes of the Crown Law Office, Detectives Ramsey and Sedgwick of the Police Headquarters, and press reporters. 2 solicitors were also present in the interests of Mrs. Mort. The accused woman occupied a corner of the Reformatory Hospital in which at present she's the only patient. Her bed is partly screened. This morning she was sitting in a comfortable chair and was neatly dressed in a navy and white striped skirt of Scotch paid type, cream georgette blouse and white shoes and stockings. Across her shoulders was a cream silk dressing jacket, exquisitely embroidered in Japanese designs, and on her lap lay a book entitled In the Shadows. When the court officially entered the ward, she was reading, but her appearance was suggestive of a very great weakness. Her face was very pale and drawn, and her lips were colourless. Throughout the brief proceedings, she rested her head of thick dark hair on the back of the chair and repeatedly closed her sad, tired-looking eyes, with her long, thin fingers slowly flicking the pages of her book. On a neatly arranged locker beside her was a vase of flowers and a Morocco Bible, a reading lamp and a small bottle of perfume. Though the most prominent adornment of it, was a photograph of her 2 children. Mr. Price sat beside Mrs. Mort, and when Mr. Hayes had acquainted her with the object of the visit, Detective Ramsay read to her the charge of having feloniously and maliciously murdering Dr. Tozer. Mrs. Mort made no answer to the charge. When Mr. Hayes asked for a remand, Mr. Hyman informed her that he was at present on her behalf. She smiled very slightly and answered in tones that were barely audible. "Thank you very much. I have no objection," she said. She then bade the officials good morning and began a conversation with her solicitor. It was explained that last night the accused had little sleep and that her condition today was worse than it had been since her removal to Long Bay. Since last Wednesday, however, she's been able to walk about the hospital and sit in a chair. She is visited daily by the prison doctor and is receiving every care. So it took till another month later for her to be in court. And it says Mrs. Mort charged with murder collapses in court. In Sydney, there was an element of sensation connected with the presentation of Mrs. Mort before the special court at Long Bay Penitentiary on a charge of murdering Dr. Tozer, the well-known cricketer at Linfield. Mrs. Mort, who has recovered to an extent from her illness, collapsed whilst a remand was being asked for and fell back into the chair, groping wildly in the air with her hands as the charge was read out. When she recovered, the charge was again read, and she was asked if she understood the proceedings. She replied yes, and the remand was granted. A further inquest into Dr. Tozer's death has been fixed for the 14th of March. And in the Melbourne Herald, it outlines the inquest. It's titled Foreboding Letters, Dr. Tozer Inquest Opened, Love Affair Revealed, Mrs. Mort Faints in Court. After a delay of 11 weeks caused by the prolonged illness of Mrs. Dorothy Mort, the inquest concerning the death of Dr. Claude John Tozer was opened by the coroner today. The tragedy took place at Mrs. Mort's house at Linfield on December the 21st. Dr. Tozer paid a visit to Mrs. Mort and was conversing with her in the morning. Subsequently in the afternoon, Miss Florence Fizell, Mrs. Mort's companion, forced her way into the room and found Mrs. Mort in a state of collapse. Later, the police arrived and found Dr. Tozer dead on the couch. The tragedy created a sensation as Dr. Tozer, who was a single man and was well known as a cricketer. Mrs. Mort was arrested on a charge of murder, but as she was in ill health at the time, she was placed in hospital. A large crowd gathered early outside the coroner's court but was disappointed as Mrs. Mort was taken to the court in a motor car at 8 o'clock. By 9:30 the crowd was so large the police had to take the crowd in hand, and only half of those assembled were able to get into the court. In the courtroom, Mrs. Mort, who was accommodated with an easy chair, lay back wearily with her eyes closed. She had a black veil over her head. Constable Marsden, who gave evidence as to the finding of the body of Tozer, said he found a letter signed Claude on a table. The letter included the following passages. Dearest lady, though the time drags slowly enough whilst waiting, it seems to fly fast enough and far too fast when we do meet, which is funny but true. The telephone messages have been duly received, and if continued, will no doubt make me a firm believer in Conan Doyle's spiritualistic theories. It is to be hoped that my messages, as sent, were received and enabled you to get a little more sleep than usual. At any rate, they were intended to comfort you and in this way help you through the dreary nights. It only shows how temperaments differ. The more anxious I am, the better I sleep, although apparently my subconscious self is busy at work trying to unravel some problems, for in the morning a new aspect seems to dawn on me. So I think I must be or have a receptive soul. That is, if a doctor can have a soul. Another little item for you to discover. There would certainly seem to be unfathomed depths to my makeup, which no one has yet troubled to explore. So there is an adventure for you. Au revoir, yours longingly, signed Claude. Witness said that he found numerous other letters, and amongst those signed Claude and addressed affectionately to Mrs. Mort was one in which the writer said, "I am in a serious mood tonight, probably because lack of patience has given me plenty of time to think. Naturally, the thoughts are of you. There is nothing else now to be interested in except work, to conquer the hunger. But, as it is such a big but, where it is going to lead us, and when or how it is going to finish, it is really a very apparent problem because it always brings you up against the same old answer of nowhere. You know, or should by now, that I am never happier than when you are near me. Even the sight of you seems to comfort me, which is all very well for the present, but that platonic kind of existence cannot go on forever. Don't blame me too much, Di, if my reserve goes to the wind some day. There is in every one of us some deep-seated fountain of emotion, call it passion if you like. Mine has never been tapped except by you, and some day the pressure will be too great for me, and who knows what I would say or do. So, lady fair, it is better for us to take stock of things now before I break out, and consider what is to be done. At present I am content to glide on the river of bliss, but the small conscience sits on the banks and shows the danger signal." One of the letters was signed Diana Mort and was addressed to Mrs. Tozer, the late doctor's mother, and it said, "Your son has loved me, and I think more perfectly and wonderfully than is permitted most people. I have twice asked him to let me release him, but he would not have it. Without any word of warning or even suggestion, he asked another girl to marry him. And also the worst of it is he loves me too, but he feels that it is hopeless between us. Had he told me at first and then asked this girl to be his wife, I would have at once given him his freedom. For 5 wonderful months he has made me happy, begging me to trust him as I implicitly did. I have been a most unhappy woman, and from our first meeting he loved me and swore to make me care. The shock I cannot survive. There are more cowardly things than taking one's life, and that is treachery to a woman, a trusting woman. He suggested divorce, but neither of us could bear that. But he said he would wait for me and was content to do so. He says how unhappy he really is, but it is too late." The following letter was written by Mrs. Mort to her mother. She said, "I feel ill again tonight and have a feeling I am going to cross the other side soon. Everything is dust in my mouth. I live in a perpetual state of nerves. Should anything happen to me, darling, will you ever look after my darling children? Dr. Tozer was here this morning and comes tomorrow. He swore to make me care for him as he cared for me, which he has done, and I love and worship him to the exclusion of everything. He asked me to marry him and later on to get a divorce, but there were the children. I tried to be strong and fine. He begged me to be everything to him. For months I held out, and then one day we just forgot everything. Life is bitter, hell, and I feel I cannot go on living. We love each other more and more. There was no going back once having crossed the Rubicon. We say goodbye tomorrow, but we'll still meet as pals, which I don't think possible. He has been the most wonderful and perfect lover, but I cannot spoil his life. God forgive me. Goodbye, my precious mum. It is history repeating itself. I cannot help attracting men, as this last year has proven, but I have never thought or meant to be wicked." The witness also said that he found 2 revolvers and a box containing 36 bullets. On the 5th of January, while in hospital, Mrs. Mort called him to her bedside and said, "Sergeant, did you ever shoot anyone?" He replied no, and warned her that anything she might say would be used in evidence against her. She replied, "I do not mind. I am prepared to suffer any penalty the law may inflict. I shot Dr. Tozer. He was sitting on the couch. I was standing behind him and was showing him with my right hand a little present I had bought for him. I took the revolver from off the ledge behind him with my right hand and shot him in the back of the head. I then went around to the end of the couch and shot him through the side of the head. I then undid his vest and shot him in the chest and buttoned up the vest again. I do not know what made me do it. I lay in his arms for 2 hours afterwards." This evidence caused a stir in the court, and just as the policeman had concluded his evidence, Mrs. Mort fainted. She had to be fanned, and as the court was stuffy, she was carried by Detective Wickham out of the court. The evidence went on in her absence. Dr. Palmer gave evidence of having examined the bullet wounds in the head and the body, and he did not think the wounds were self-inflicted. And then the solicitor for Mrs. Mort asked, when you saw Mrs. Mort in hospital on the 24th of December, she was then certified as insane. Was her condition consistent with this? And Dr. Palmer said, yes, possibly. You might call it emotional insanity. There are a number of different kinds of insanity, but I do not care to say anything on that. I only know her condition just as I saw her. Dr. J. Murray said that when he called on Mrs. Mort's residence on December the 21st, she was lying on her back, breathing very heavily. He detected an odour and upon examining her found a bullet wound in the breast. The police in the meantime found a laudanum bottle. Knowing her family history, you guessed she had been deranged in her mind for some considerable time, and Dr. Murray said, I should say so. A sudden shock would be liable to put her off balance? He said, I should think so. Suppose she got news that her father had committed suicide, would that cause her to become deranged? And he said, I should imagine so. Detective Inspector Leary stated that in a wastepaper basket in the house he found a torn-up photograph of Mrs. Mort with writing on a piece of it. Mr. Mort told him that Mrs. Mort had been ill for about 7 months. The witness asked him if he was aware that his wife and Dr. Tozer were on intimate terms. Mort replied that he did not wish to discuss the matter. Evidence was given as Mrs. Mort having purchased an automatic pistol at a shop in King Street. Among the exhibits in the case was Dr. Tozer's visiting cards, a photograph of Mrs. Mort. Both were found in the room of the tragedy and they were torn into small pieces and blood-stained. They were pieced together when they were produced in the court. On the back of the photograph of Mrs. Mort, it said, Claude Tozer, from the woman you love and reverence above all others, and was the highest incentive for good in your life. Florence Fazell, formerly Mrs. Mort's companion, gave evidence that Mrs. Mort had been ill and that Dr. Tozer had been visiting her for some months. Prior to the tragedy, Mrs. Mort did not seem to be sane. On the day of the tragedy, he went into Mrs. Mort's bedroom. Mrs. Mort was in bed. She left them in the room together. She heard what she thought was a shot and went to the door, but it was locked. She then asked if she could go in, but Mrs. Mort said no. Mrs. Mort then said she was all right. And then the Port Pirie Recorder in South Australia, it records the continuance of the inquest into Dr. Tozer's death. It said Mrs. Mort, who was alleged to have killed Dr. Tozer, was present and fainted twice during the hearing and had to be carried from court. The mother of the deceased gave evidence that Mrs. Mort told her Dr. Tozer said he was getting married. Mrs. Mort said that she was determined that if she could not have him, no other woman would. Mr. Matt Casey, who represented Mrs. Mort, sought to prove that his client was insane at the time of the tragedy, and he also endeavoured to prove that insanity was hereditary in her family. Mrs. Mort, in reply to the coroner, had nothing to say. The coroner returned a finding of murder against Mrs. Mort and committed her for trial, and Mrs. Mort collapsed at the announcement of the verdict. Beatrice Tozer, mother of the deceased, gave evidence that her son was one of temperate habits. She knew her son was visiting Mrs. Mort for hysteria and neurasthenia fairly often. Witness saw Mrs. Mort on the 22nd of December. She was in bed and appeared ill. Mrs. Mort said to her, "Sit down. I want you to know the whole truth of the matter. I feel I am dying. 2 years before I met Dr. Tozer, I had been desperately unhappy, the reasons for which I need not to go into now. When I fell ill, my husband called the doctor in. I killed the doctor." Beatrice Tozer, continuing, said she asked Mrs. Mort, "How did you do it?" Mrs. Mort said, "I went up close to him and immediately he died. He never suffered." I asked her if she loved him, why kill him? She hesitated and then said, "We had talked it over together and decided it was the only way out. I said, tell the truth. If you are dying, you knew that the doctor never intended to take his life or yours." Continuing, said Mrs. Tozer, Mrs. Mort said, "I am telling you the truth. The last time the doctor came, he told me it was better for a medical man to be married, and he intended to make some girl to be his wife. It was too cruel. I could not bear it, and I determined that if I could not have him, no other woman would." And she then said, "Kiss me and forgive me." Harold Mort, the accused woman's husband, gave evidence that Dr. Tozer was attending his wife for 6 months. He left home on the 21st of December. He could account for all of his movements on that day. He did not receive a telephone message to come home, and when he arrived home he was entirely unaware of what had happened. When he arrived, he found the police there and his wife unconscious. He had a conversation with his wife, but he would rather not say what it was, and he did not know she had a revolver. He was convinced that his wife was not rational. He knew her father had attacked her with an axe and had attempted suicide. He knew that her father was tried and acquitted on the grounds of insanity, and he later went to New Zealand where he committed suicide. The coroner asked Mrs. Mort whether she wished to give evidence, and she answered no. On the 8th of April 1921, in the Warwick Daily News in Queensland, it accounts the trial of Mrs. Mort. Charge of murder, medical evidence, plea of insanity. In Sydney on Thursday, the trial of Mrs. Mort on a charge of having murdered Dr. Tozer was commenced today by His Honour Chief Justice Cullen. All available seats in the gallery were occupied an hour before proceedings began, and a crowd of about 100 were unable to gain admission. Mrs. Mort was heavily veiled. Dr. Aubrey Palmer narrated a conversation which took place at her house between Mrs. Mort and himself 3 days before the tragedy. Mrs. Mort said, "I won't have any blood taken from me." The witness assured her he had no intention of doing anything of the kind. Mrs. Mort then said, "I have been delayed getting here by my husband. He has been measuring me for my coffin," and, holding her hands out about 2 feet apart, said, "It's a very pretty coffin about this size." She talked about things as another person would talk about the weather. She was at this time certifiably insane. Claude Tozer's mother gave evidence and said her son was not engaged to be married. Dr. Bly was the first witness for the defence, and he said that Mrs. Mort's father some time ago attacked his wife and son with an axe and cut his own throat. The accused 2 days after the tragedy was in a critical state mentally and, in his opinion, insane. He thought she was quite insane, and, as he feared she might attempt to take her own life, he asked for police supervision. She was so elated at what had occurred and made statements which were not rational, saying that her son was to be born, which would be Tozer's. The Chief Justice asked the witness if he had formed any opinion as to her condition, and he stated that she appeared to be suffering from emotional insanity. When the trial resumed on the next day, Arthur Shirley, a picture producer, gave evidence that he met the accused in September last when she asked him to place her in a picture. She remarked her life was not of much use to her, and she had an idea that men were following her with the intention of killing her. Subsequently, she stated that she would commit suicide. The Crown Prosecutor called Dr. Lee Brown, who said that he saw no evidence of insanity when Mrs. Mort was under his care at Long Bay Penitentiary. Mr. Mack addressed the jury. He said that Mrs. Mort was on trial for murder, and if the jury found her guilty, they sentenced her to be hanged by the neck until she was dead. After all the shame and anxiety, he went on, the seduction and betrayal by the man she depended on most of all, after all the suffering and hell she has experienced, and all she's going through now, you are asked to find that the poor wreck there, pointing to Mrs. Mort, guilty of murder. Murder of whom? Murder of a man who was first her lover, then her seducer, then her betrayer. The man who not only betrayed her, but who betrayed the very best traditions of his profession. That woman has gone through enough to turn the brain of a many hard-headed man. Could there be any wonder she went mad? The hereditary taint of her father might have lain dormant until a certain age, or until someone stirred it up. She has to bear the burden of the inheritance of a madman, the daughter of a homicide and then a suicide. He submitted that the jury could not return a verdict of murder. Mrs. Mort had no intention of killing the doctor at all. And then on the Friday, the trial was concluded and the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Mrs. Mort was detained at the Reformatory for Women at Long Bay during the Governor's pleasure. However, further evidence was given concerning the accused's mentality. Mr. Mack, in opening his address to the jury, concluded there was not a shadow of a doubt that Dr. Tozer betrayed Mrs. Mort, and there was absolutely no doubt the woman was insane at the time. The judge, summing up, said the jury, in considering Dr. Tozer's conduct, would be fully justified in determining to their own satisfaction how far the injuries received at the war had affected him. After reviewing the medical testimony, the jury had a duty given, which no one could omit to take into consideration, the fact of the insanity of the father of the accused, who had exhibited murderous tendencies. The jury returned with a verdict of guilty while of unsound mind, but at the judge's direction altered it to not guilty on the ground of insanity. Mr. Coyle said the woman is therefore acquitted on the ground of insanity. The judge said, "I have never known a verdict to be quoted in these circumstances in any other words." The accused, in a helpless condition, was then carried out of the court on a chair on which she had been sitting in the proceedings. So 3 years later, there was an article on the 8th of January 1924 titled "Release Sought, Mrs. Mort's Imprisonment, Murder of Dr. Tozer Recalled." In Sydney, efforts were being made to secure the release from Long Bay Jail of Mrs. Mort. She was convicted in 1921 of the murder of Dr. Tozer and sent to jail for that indefinite period represented by the constitutional phrase, "during the governor's pleasure." Since her memorable visit to a Sydney dentist some months ago, a veil of silence has hung over Mrs. Mort. Her husband has continuously been in communication with her, however, and it is said that from him that the authorities have learnt that all was not well with her. A doctor examined Mrs. Mort, and in his opinion was that an important operation was necessary. It was not a matter of life and death, but if action was not taken at this stage, the omission would affect the life of Mrs. Mort. He said it has been learnt that Mrs. Mort declined to consent to the operation unless she was given an assurance that she would not be returned to the jail. 3 days later, Mrs. Mort not to be released. The New South Wales Minister of Justice, Mr. Lay, states that Mrs. Mort, who murdered Dr. Tozer, will not be released from prison but will remain at Long Bay Penitentiary. This statement was made in consequence of efforts made to secure Mrs. Mort's release on the grounds that a doctor advised her to undergo an operation. Mr. Lay said that Mrs. Mort would have every opportunity to undergo the operation, but when she recovered, she would have to return to Long Bay. 5.5 years later, Mrs. Mort, who murdered Dr. Tozer some 9 years ago in Sydney, is to be released from jail. Dorothy Mort's children, Poppy and Morris. So Poppy Virginia Mort was born on the 3rd of March 1912 in Sydney, and she married George Branson Hetherington, a civil engineer who was 11 years older than her, on the 29th of November 1940 at Willara. They had no children, and Poppy died on the 17th of May 1991, aged 79. Dorothy's other child, Morris Mackay Mort, was born on the 25th of October 1915 at Willara in New South Wales. He married Joyce Christina Howe on the 14th of December 1942 at Chatswood in New South Wales. He was a mechanic and they had 2 children, and Morris died at Pennant Hills in New South Wales on the 10th of June 1985 at the age of 69. So tune in to my bonus episodes. It gives a lot more detail into the Mort family, but also the Tozer family and Dorothy's family, where you may have gleaned that there were some sensational occurrences, particularly with her father and his state of mind.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.